You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is radical radio, and that means more than just alternative current affairs and political coverage.
We're radical because we're an independent media outlet, owned and operated by the community.
We're radical because we give communities the control of their own shows, with their own music, in their own languages.
We're radical because we provide a media platform for communities to build their own power to create social change.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call us on 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
Minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne, 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. We thank the people of the Community Radio Network for ensuring that community stations around this country, north to south, east to west, in every state and territory, have the opportunity to listen to the Anarchist World This Week. My name is Joseph Toscano, and if you're wondering what anarchy is all about, no, it's not what's happening in the world today. That's chaos. Anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers, not without rules. A society based on direct democratic principles and holding wealth in common. And if you look at the situation around the world, it doesn't matter what colour you are, what language you speak, what's your culture, what religious beliefs you follow, your identity, whatever. The fact is that most of the problems that we face as individuals, communities, nation-states are based on the concept of inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. This is a universal struggle, crosses all cultures, has been going on for thousands of years, and it's a privilege in the 21st century to continue to hold that banner aloft. Now, I know you're all worried about artificial intelligence. Well, I'm not. You know why? Artificial intelligence is possibly our pathway to nirvana. You like that? Artificial intelligence is the human race's pathway to nirvana. There's only one problem, as you know. Artificial intelligence has become the private property of a handful of individuals which are using their wealth and power, to extend their wealth and power. But that's not the issue. I just want to look at it holistically, because there's a lot of garbage spoken about artificial intelligence. And in many ways, artificial intelligence, this struggle about artificial intelligence, is very similar to what happened in the Roman Empire over 2,000 years ago. When the city-state of Rome began to expand and expand and expand, you had that universal struggle between the plebeians and the patricians. The patricians were the ruling classes, the plebeians did the work. But as the Roman Empire, as I kept saying, expanded, what happened is the greater the military victories, the more slaves, that's right, unpaid workers, that's what a slave is, poured into the expanded Roman Empire. And obviously the patricians took advantage of this. And what did they do? The same thing we do today when we globalise, when we send off work offshore to parts of the world where there are no trade unions and people are paid a pittance. They got rid of the plebeians. So when a famous general whose name escapes me was marching from Spain back to Rome, he noticed these villages of plebeians on the outskirts of these large estates which were owned by patricians and run by slaves. Now, obviously, this imbalance caused a great deal of anger and distress in the Roman Empire, actually the city of Rome and the citizens. And we had what was introduced was a universal basic income. Bread and circuses. Remember the old saying? Bread and circuses. By the 1st century AD, plebeians were able to enjoy almost 240 public holidays from a 365-day calendar. I've gone mad there. And they had subsidised food, subsidised housing. Because, you see, the patricians weren't pretty smart. They said, look, if we want to maintain our hegemony, increase our wealth, increase our power, we need to do something to ensure that the plebeians, who outnumber us, have their basic human needs as well as their, entertainment needs looked after by the empire. So let's switch the clock forward 2024 years, okay, or 2000, whatever. And we have artificial intelligence. So what is artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence is basically a digital mechanism which reduces the need for human labour. Today, we live in a society which is based primarily on a wage system. That's what we call it, wage slavery. It's a wage system. And the type of life people enjoy is related to the amount of dollars they can bring in to the household, especially the amount of disposable dollars. So when you remove the capacity of a significant section of the population to earn an income to not only look after their basic needs but look after their aspirations, then you've got a potentially lethal situation. And let's not forget that's why a social security system was introduced after the World War II, because people expected a little bit after they'd sacrificed their families and their lives in this war. So we've got the potential now to create a society where everybody receives a universal basic income. Now, this may not be possible in some parts of the world, but as far as Australia is concerned, it is totally possible. Now, when I talk about a universal basic income, I'm talking about an income which not only satisfies basic needs, but also satisfies the needs that we have as individuals, as in families and groups, to intermingle, interact. So in many ways, there is a positive, there is a silver lining to the cloud, and that is the introduction of a universal basic income in this country to overcome the issue of what happens when hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of wage earners are displaced by the introduction of artificial intelligence, especially in the productive process as well as the process where, you need people to regulate things and manage things. We saw a little bit of this occur during the COVID-19 pandemic, where social security benefits were doubled and businesses were supported. But the important thing is, we are at an important juncture in human history. And at the end of the 19th century, Australia was at the forefront, or the Australian colonies were at the forefront in terms of the struggle to improve the lives of people. As we approach the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, we should be demanding the introduction of a universal basic income. Those of you who are concerned that somebody on a social security benefit and somebody who's a billionaire gets a universal basic income, the important thing is to remember, for a taxation system, you can bring that income quite easily. And if you're concerned about who's going to set a universal basic income, well, we have a Fair Work Commission. I'm not asking them to do it, but I'm just saying you could have a special commission which could determine what a universal basic income means. And that means that maybe during periods of your life, or your children's life, because I don't expect this to be introduced during my lifetime, they could have periods of their lives, years, where they could follow certain interests, do community work, increase their volunteering, enjoy themselves without the fear of not having the basic necessities of life. Think about it. Artificial intelligence is equivalent to slavery in the Roman Empire. A universal basic income is a mechanism by which to maintain order and have a secure future for everybody in our society. The other option, as you know, is too horrible to think of. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast to you courtesy of the Community Radio Satellite. My name is Joseph Toscano. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Have you noticed the crescendo of interest in the US presidential, Congress and Senate elections in the US of A? Now, I could pontificate till the cows come home. And they did come home this morning, didn't they? It is Diwali. But the fact is that I have no influence, you have no influence, and it's Americans who'll make the decision of who they elect as president, who they decide they want as president. Do they want a billionaire rapist as president, or do they want a warmonger as president, They can make their decisions. It's their problem, not mine. That's where I'm wrong. And what concerns me about the American election is not what the result is going to be, although a number of people think it's the end of the USA. And let's not forget the United States of America went through a civil war which led to the death of over 1 million, mainly men, from the North and South over the question of slavery. Let's not forget that. So obviously the USA will continue in whatever form. But what concerns me is how over the last 20 to 30 years, the Australian government and the Australian military has become fully integrated in the military digital industrial complex in the USA. Not just in terms of having US bases on their soil, which have been responsible for directing some of the worst atrocities in the 21st century, not because the number of United States troops have increased on Australian soil up to 3,000 a minimum of 3,000. Not the fact that we have nuclear submarines. We bought nuclear submarines or just spent, a few $1 billion or buying some so-called missiles. But what concerns me is that militarily, politically, socially, culturally, we are now totally integrated into the United States of America's agenda. We have no capacity anymore to even determine our own foreign policy, as we've seen with the carnage in Gaza and the West Bank and southern Lebanon. We don't have the capacity to even defend ourselves in time of attack because we're totally reliant on United States equipment because it's fully integrated. And the cost we will pay is the cost we paid in the Vietnam War, but magnified many times over. Because things have changed. We are now a target. That's right. It doesn't matter where you live in this country, whether you live in Alice Springs near Pine Gap, or whether you live in Melbourne or Unadata. The fact are, we are now targets because weapons have become so advanced, weapon systems have become so advanced that we are no longer isolated because of our geographical isolation. So instead of forming alliances with the people around us, we now find our situation where we're totally integrated, as I said before, into the military, digital, industrial complex of the United States of America, which means that we have no control over foreign policy and will be expected to sacrifice our people to protect US interests across the globe when there are increasing challenges to the hegemony that the United States of America has enjoyed for so many years after World War II. So Americans will make their decision. We will be expected to bear the cost. That's the problem. That's the central problem that nobody seems to be talking about. The fact that we are so fully integrated into their political, industrial, military, digital complex that we have lost any independence that we think we have. Now, some people think, well, this is good because they will defend us. Well, the fact is, as we've seen over and over again over the last century, and as Mr. Trump keeps telling you, make America great again, the fact is that the United States is only interested in their interests. They're not interested in anybody else, even their closest allies. They're not interested. Every time things get a bit rough, they cut and run. Vietnam, Afghanistan, just two recent examples. So think about it. There is a huge cost we will carry, irrespective of who's elected as American president. And it's about time that we started having a debate in this country about standing on our own feet and actually, realising that we live in this part of the world. We're not on the East Coast or the West Coast of the United States of America. You can't get some, tugboats, put a few hooks into Australia and drag it to the West Coast of America. Impossible. This is ludicrous. Total ludicrous situation. So whoever is president, whoever controls Congress, whoever controls the Senate, we have totally lost any independent capacity we have to, one, defend ourselves, and two, to have any independent foreign policy, and 3, to have any independent economic policy which is not based on a private investment for private profit model. And that's the issue we should all be worried about. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. You know, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Ever heard that one? And if you don't want to abuse birds, how about half of something is better than all of nothing? I think the Greens, the Green Party, the Australian Greens, need to understand, after their relatively poor results in the Queensland state election, that the policy they've been following over the last few years regarding blocking, with the assistance of the Liberal National Party and improving, their image in society, blocking much needed changes is not working. It's just not working. Obviously, look, I would like to see the creation of society, based on egalitarian principles. Now, I know that is a long-term project, and I know that any campaign, whether it's a campaign to introduce a road crossing or to introduce a universal basic income, right, is a struggle. And sometimes, in order to get something, we need to make compromises. And if we're not willing to make those compromises, we'll find ourselves in the same situation we found ourselves 15 years ago when the Greens refused to, put forward the Labor Party policy on the climate change, and see what that happened. 10 years. Now, the Liberal National Party, as you know, is happy to use anything to protect the interests of the people that support it, the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and many of the people that have the disposable income in this society to invest and use this country's investment-friendly laws to enrich themselves at the expense of the rest of the community. They're quite happy to do that. They're quite happy to see the Greens, the Australian Greens, block legislation in the Senate time and time again, which may not be everything that we wish for, but at least it's half of nothing. So if the parliamentary agenda or the parliamentary sittings coming to an end and an election need to be held by May next year, the fact is that continuing on the same policy is not going to benefit anybody, least of all the Australian Greens, because they're seen as extremists. That's right. They're seen as illegitimate by the Liberal National Party as well as the Australian Labor Party. But the fact is, the current policies, the current blocking of some much needed reforms in the Senate on ideological grounds is really not going to help anybody. Think about it. If you're a member of the Greens Party, think about it. Do you want to be wiped out at the next election? Or do you want to continue to have some input and impact on necessary reforms that are needed in the society? Because if the Liberal National Party wins power in its own right, the fact is that the agenda they will set is an agenda which will put this country's people back generations. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. So remember, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, and half of something is better than all of nothing. Now, we've had a little report on the COVID-19 and how it was handled by the government of the day. And the phrase that was used was they were building an aircraft as they were flying an aircraft. And it's quite right, because, you see, for some time, what we've done in this country is outsource and privatise many, many, many important facilities that are required to maintain public health. And when COVID-19 hit, we didn't even have a Centre for Disease Control. I have noticed it's been recommended that we now have a Centre for Disease Control. Now, any idiot could have told you that. So what we had is a disjointed response. And this disjointed response, in many ways, was magnified by the fact that we are a federation. Now, it's very hard to explain to a lot of people because we live in a depoliticised, apolitical society where most people don't even know what it is to be a citizen. It's very hard to explain what a federation is and why Australia is a federation. And I'll do a little history lesson. I know you hate history because as an Australian, all Australians, including myself, we understand that history started this morning, you know, when I woke up and when you woke up. That's history, not what happened in the past. Obviously, if we did that, we may be able to make some significant changes in this society, but let's not worry about history. So let's look at federation. Now, when the British authorities granted independence to the Australian colonies, there were 6 functioning colonies. Each was independent of the other. And those of you who know your history will know the little funny stories that, you know, that the gauge, the railway gauge was different in Victoria and Sydney, and when you got to the Albury-Wodonga border, you'd have to change trains. And those of you who know your history and live in Melbourne may have gone down to Venus, Half Moon Bay, down between, I think, Black Rock and Beaumaris down there. And there's a little ship there called the Cerberus. Well, in 1896, the Victorian government, concerned about a Russian invasion, nothing seems to have changed, does it? Not only set up cannon emplacements at Point Nepean, but also bought the HMAS Cerberus to defend Victoria. Now, there was a big debate regarding federation, which went on for over a decade. This is in the 1890s. And eventually, a watered-down constitution was created, which obviously didn't acknowledge this country's First Nations people or had any significant human rights in it, was put to each colony. Interestingly, the colony of New South Wales rejected the first referendum to federate because they didn't want to pay the bill for the rest of the bludgers on the Australian continent. Well, the West Australians never actually got the chance to vote and were incorporated into the new nation of Australia in 1901. So when you have a federation, each state, in order to get one unified sovereign nation state, the power that the central government had was very, very limited. I'll give you an example. Now, you know our friends in the federal police. Well, they were created in a very interesting way. When Billy Hughes, the ALP, the Labor Prime Minister who changed sides because he was for conscription, he wanted another 60,000 young Australian men to die in the European killing fields for the glory of God, King and country. When he arrived at, I think it was Stanthorpe, it could have been Warwick. Yeah, it was Warwick. in 1917 at the second referendum promote the idea of conscription. Let's not forget, plebiscite. Let's not forget both plebiscites were defeated and conscription was not introduced in this country during World War I, but that's a different story, right? He had an egg thrown at him, right? Splattered on his suit. He ordered the state policeman to arrest the renegade. And the copper said to him, look, mate, you may be Prime Minister of Australia, but I take my orders from Red Ted Theodore, who was the Premier of Queensland at that particular time. So they rushed back to Canberra and created the Federal Police. And if you go back to those times, there's a fascinating cartoon of a Bobby with a truncheon coming out of a rotten egg and saying this is Billy's present to the Australian people. But what I'm trying to say is states have considerable power, although they've given up certain powers to the federal government. And what COVID-19 did is highlight the powers that individual states had, and that's why different states had different regulations at different times regarding how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in terms of the advice which went to government at that particular point in time, the advice came from a number of sources, both private and public. Now, having a centre of disease control, whose job it will be to educate and deal with pandemics, is a sensible idea which should have been introduced decades ago. Decades ago. And those of you who think that pandemics happen every 100 years or so, think again. With the increasing growth of the human population and the fact that it's invading more and more natural resource territory, and the interaction between human beings, insects, animals, bacteria, viruses, it's quite likely that we'll see another pandemic within the next 10 years or so. And the fact is, COVID-19 wasn't like the Black Death, where over 50% of the population disappeared in many European countries. This was a relatively minor pandemic. And the fact is that because we're a federation of states, unless we have a federal decision-making body to deal with that situation, we will see the same higgledy-piggledy responses from different states, because states still retain an extraordinary amount of power. If I had my way, you'd abolish the states, set up, say, 50 local authorities across the country, and hey, bingo. But again, that would require major constitutional change or a revolution, and I can't see any in the offering. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Look, if you want to leave messages for me, 0439 395 489. If you want to learn more, you can go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest website, pipsy.net, join online, Facebook pages, YouTube channels. It just goes on and on. It's everywhere. The fact is, we can have as much of this stuff as you like, but the fact is, unless people become involved, become active, do things, nothing changes. You may think we live in a virtual world and click activism is your thing, but the fact is, clicked activism is nothing without feet on the ground. Let's move on. Murdoch. What a piece of human, how shall I put it? I can't think of words. Now, we're all watching the American Abyss, all right? American fighting American. They're going to make the country great again. Get rid of all those immigrants. As if the American dream wasn't based on immigration, but that's a different story. Now, our very own Mr. Murdoch, Mr. Rupert Murdoch, who's now in his 90s, squabbling with his kids about this trust that was set up years ago to evenly divide the estate of the great man in 4 equal portions. He's very worried. He's very worried because, you see, Mr. Murdoch and his favourite kid, Foxtel News, not Lachlan, let's get it right. Foxtel News has plunged the American nation into the abyss. And why? To make a buck. To make $1. To make $1. Foxtel News, which is totally owned by Murdoch and his cronies, has been at the heart of the disinformation, the misinformation, the half-truths, the nil-truths that dominate United States thinking in 2024. Foxtel News was the harbinger of 1 million Americans dying of COVID-19. So, think about the extraordinary power that our individuals and corporations can exert in a private investment for private investment society. I mean, we all talk about the Chinese Communist Party and the dictatorship and the North Korean dictatorship, but the fact is the differences are minimal in terms of the power they are able to exercise. In parliamentary democracies, it's through subverting the parliamentary system, which was initially based on creating the greatest good for the greatest number, or that was the philosophy. And a dictatorship where power is centralised in the hands of a clique or an individual. And that's the issue I keep talking about on the Anarchist World this week, is about centralisation of power. The struggle is to decentralise power. And what the Murdoch legacy, the Foxtel News legacy, is a legacy of division and hatred in order to make a buck. And obviously poor old Rupert is concerned that if the empire is divided in 4, his hate machine may be disassembled by some of his kiddies who he doesn't see eye to eye to. The tragedies of wealth. You're listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Well, you thought it couldn't get worse, could you, in Gaza? The brutality continues, the carnage continues, war criminals continue to rule, child killers continue to be hailed as heroes. Another 90 Palestinians dead? So what? Another 50 Lebanese dead? So what? You know? The bombs keep coming. The world's greatest military power continues to funnel weapons into the state of Israel. The 800,000 Palestinians who were displaced from their lands over 70 years ago, and their descendants continue to be ostracised, marginalised, humiliated, starved, infrastructure totally destroyed. And this is happening under our gaze. That's the beauty about technology, is that you can see dismembered people being blown up by bombs and go, tut tut. You can do your little walk every day, It's over, 42,500, maybe 43,000. Who knows how many under the rubble. You can do your little walk, little marathon. Every metre there's a dead person. But now it's getting even better. Because you see, UNRWA, the United Nations aid agency, which has been assisting Palestinians since 1949, has been designated. It's been banned. Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the State of Israel. Because you see, the Israeli military is understood, although the cabinet or the Israeli Parliament doesn't seem to understand, that what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon is just creating new generations of militants who have no compulsion, no restrictions in terms of seeking vengeance regarding the havoc which has been wreaked in Gaza. This is an atrocity beyond an atrocity. And now they're trying to ban, they've passed legislation to ban, the major organisation which gives aid to Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Because they understand. And they're not dealing with a terrorist organisation, Hamas. They are dealing with a people that have been displaced, forcefully displaced from their lands to create a new nation state, the State of Israel. And the tragedy is not just what is happening and the atrocities which are occurring on a daily basis, and the fact that we fight war criminals. Remember that war criminal, the Prime Minister of Israel, was feted in the US Congress and the Senate. At least we haven't had the same disgusting display in the Australian Parliament. But if Mr Dutton gets elected, I'm sure he'll invite Mr Netanyahu to come along to address Parliament, but that's a different story. And we just expect it to be observers. Bread and circuses. Observers. I mean, anything the Romans did, this pales in significance when you think about it in terms of bread and circuses. Another bomb. If we can kill one militant and we destroy 100 Palestinians to kill that militant, well, it's justified, isn't it? They were a militant, weren't they? Listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. And remember, in most states there are demonstrations regarding what's happening, and I encourage you to seek out what's happening in your part of the world and get involved, because these are the type of atrocities that are occurring as a result of our support. Whether it's active or whether it's passive, it's because of our support. Now, in many regards, what we are seeing today in Gaza and the revenge, and the key word is revenge, which has been wreaked on the Palestinian people, has had no equivalent in the 21st century. Now, obviously, there have been disputes. We see the war in the Ukraine and the atrocities that occur there. But in terms of the reality of a people who've been under direct attack for over 13 months in an area half the size of Melbourne, possibly the size of Canberra, You imagine it. The bombs that have been let off, the hospitals that have been razed to the ground, the people that have been injured, the tens of thousands have been denied basic medical assistance who've got medical issues. And what we see is, let's hope, and the key word is hope, that whoever wins the US elections, that these atrocities will come to an end. Because if they don't, all it does is diminish us as a people and diminish any credibility the so-called Western parliamentary democracies have in the world today. Let's move on. Now, there's a few activities I'd like to talk about, but I would like to talk about a struggle that everybody seems to have forgotten about, and I can understand why. The West Papuan independence struggle. In, I think it was 1967, or it could have been 69, the Dutch authorities vacated West Papua and the Indonesians took over. And over the last 60 years, there's been a consistent independence struggle in West Papua, which has led to the deaths of over 500,000 people, either directly or indirectly as a result of war. And what we've seen is a transmigration program where Indonesians from other parts of Indonesia have been offered free land in West Papua, which has made West Papuans now almost a minority in their own country. But despite West Papuan military having almost one military personnel in West Papua for every adult West Papuan, we're talking over almost 220,000 military personnel in West Papua. And despite the ostracisation and marginalisation of West Papuans in terms of the care and education they're entitled to and the basic services they're entitled to, we still see a West Papuan independence movement not only working amongst the people, but also carrying out a military struggle against the Indonesian occupation. But the dilemma is that you may not have noticed that in the last few months, the Indonesian military, which was the primary ruler of Indonesia for almost 3 decades under Suharto, has now gained ascendancy in the Indonesian parliament, and a war criminal who'd been banned from Australia and the United States of America, who went to, suck eggs, I think it was in Lebanon, could have been Saudi Arabia, is now the president, elected by 60% of the Indonesian people, who somehow had forgotten that these same people were responsible for the massacre of almost 2 million Indonesians in the mid-60s. So my concern is this. My concern is that the Indonesian government, especially if the Liberal National Party wins the next election in its own right, will pressure the Australian government to declare West Papuan independence groups as terrorist organisations. When you see the State of Israel declaring a United Nations humanitarian organisation as thinking of declaring, I don't think they did, thinking of declaring as a terrorist organisation, you can understand. All you need to do is pass a bit of legislation in Parliament. You can declare anybody you like as a terrorist organisation. So That's my concern. And as the coordinator of the West Papuan Rent Collective, and for almost 10 years now, ordinary people in this country, not the extraordinary ones, not the rich, not the powerful, not the celebrities, not the well-known, but pensioners, workers, have been freely giving to the West Papuan Rent Collective to ensure the West Papuans have an office in this country which can be used as a mechanism to coordinate the West Papuan independence struggle across the country. This is not paper revolutionaries. These are people who have been struggling and suffering and paying the price for an independence struggle that they've been involved in for almost 60 years. Now, the office is in Docklands, and 3 times a year, the West Papuan Rent Collective has the honour of being the guests of the West Papuan office. And once again, on the 24th of November will be the last gathering for this year, not only for members of the West Papuan Rent Collective, but also any other interested parties. Come along, lunch at 1 to 2, speakers 2 to 3. Then we have an auction to raise money for the West Papuan office to pay the rent. So come along. And if you're really, really, really rich and you want to do the West Papua independence movement a favour, why don't you buy them an office? Maybe the office they're in now wouldn't be much. Maybe $750,000. Who knows? But seriously, as I said before, ordinary people have kept this office now open for over almost a decade, almost 10 years, and it's given the West Papuan struggle not only a focus in this country, but a focus around the world. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. And don't forget, on the 10th of November, if you do find yourself in the state of Victoria, we'll be holding the annual Francesco Fantin Memorial at the Murchison Cemetery. There is a Italian war memorial at the Murchison Cemetery. Murchison, a little town about 140 kilometres from the Melbourne CBD, about 35, 40 kilometres from Shepparton. Now, Francesco Fantin was an anarchist, an atheist, an anti-militarist, and an anti-fascist. And in November 1942, while stooping to have a drink at a tap at Camp Lovedale, which is an internment camp for enemy aliens, this little anarchist was beaten to death by a fascist thug who'd been ordered by the fascists who controlled, and these are real fascists, not pretend fascists, who controlled the camp, to kill him because of the audacity he had to actually, argue against them. At the end of the war, World War II, the bodies of Italian internees, Italian prisoners of wars who died across Australia were taken to Murchison, where a special mausoleum was built by the Italian community to honour them. So join us, 9:30am. We listen to their 9:30am. I'll talk more about it next week. There's a mass, believe it or not. Francesco Fantin is the only anarchist among the 121 people interned there. But in death, we are all equal. The fascist lies with the anarchist. We are all equal. But our job is to remember history. Because what we are seeing in the world today is the very, very evil that people like Francesco Fantin fought against all their lives. You've been listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can go to the YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. You can join Public Interest Before Corporate Interest now, pipsy.net. Leave messages on 0439 395 489. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week, courtesy of the Community Radio Network across this vast land. North to south, east to west, every state, every territory. The Community Radio Network provides a different interpretation of reality. Not one which is based on misinformation and disinformation, but an interpretation of reality. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, and tell your friends about the podcast. Anarchist World this week, 3cr.org.au. Listen in next week on your favourite community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse, 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Are you a 3CR subscriber?
We really need our listeners to subscribe to the station. It helps us remain financially independent and is an important part of our community governance.
It's just $40 concession, $80 waged, $150 for a band or organisation, and $300 solidarity.
Become a 3CR subscriber today.
3CR Radical Radio.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.